Manifolds, load balancers, and Sushi Belts. Machine loading in Satisfactory comes in many forms, and if you don't want to be stuck manually feeding your machines like a mama bird forever, you're going to need to familiarize yourself with these methods. Thankfully, FICSIT has you covered, and a newly minted training facility on the West Coast is the perfect place to go to learn about all of these loading methods, where they're the most useful, and how to identify and circumvent some of their inherent flaws. Welcome to the FICSIT Learning Institute, Machine Loading Division. Let's start off easy with manifolds. A manifold is a broad term that describes any input belt, or even a pipe, that feeds multiple outputs. And they can be broken down into three distinct pieces. The throughput belt, which carries the bulk of your resources down a single path. Some kind of splitter, which allows you to portion your resources out so that some of them begin heading towards machines and some of them continue down the line. And finally, the feed belt, which actually moves the resources from your splitters into your machines. A manifold can be as long as you want or need it to be, ridiculously long even, limited only by the capacity of your throughput belt. In order to stay under that capacity, make sure that your machine inputs total less than or equal to the capacity of your highest tier belt. In this example, I'm using a Mark I belt with a capacity of 60 items per minute to distribute 45 ingots between these three machines, because that's all I need for now. However, I could include another machine at the end, or overclock my existing ones without needing to increase my tier of belt. You can also use manifolds with mergers to collect the outputs of multiple machines onto a single belt for easier transportation. Just keep in mind your capacity, as each new merge adds additional belt strain. Manifolds can also be constructed vertically, and this is even easier with the addition of vertical splitters and mergers in 1.1. These ones are constructed a bit differently though. You'll need to begin by placing a conveyor lift, which runs the length of your machines, and then attaching the splitters onto the lift. It's for this reason I would recommend starting your lift with a floor hole, as the beginning of that lift has to be before the input of your first machine. The process of attaching mergers is much the same. Do keep in mind that splitting a lift with a splitter or merger creates multiple different pieces of lift that need to be upgraded individually. Yep, even that tiny little piece of down there that refuses to be upgraded and never. Manifolds are very space efficient, often just requiring a line of splitters and mergers, and are easy to set up with only a small amount of maths required. They're also very easy to expand upon, but while you can just keep attaching machines to the end of your manifold until you run out of belt capacity, the longer your manifolds become, the more some inherent issues become obvious. Every splitter will send half of the remaining inputs to a machine and half down the line. This inherently causes earlier machines in the manifold to be oversupplied, while those later down the line are starved of resources. It's only an issue when you first start your machines, and will balance itself out eventually, so long as you're actually supplying the machines with enough inputs. Each of these machines needs 15 ingots a minute to be adequately supplied. But for a whopping 22 minutes, the last two machines were being underfed. And this is a relatively small manifold, using basic components. This issue is only exacerbated by longer production chains, as each new step in the chain needs to wait for the previous ones to fill first, and is very noticeable when dealing with recipes that have complex inputs. These manufacturers would take over an hour just to fill their internal buffers for modular frames. But if you don't want to wait for them to fill, there are a few workarounds. First off, hand-loading your machines with their inputs will allow you to skip waiting for those internal buffers to fill. You'll only need to do this once at the beginning, and your line will run smoothly from there. In comparison, the exact same manifold with hand-loaded resources took about 2 minutes to fill instead of 20. Conversely, temporarily underclocking all of your machines accomplishes the same thing. But depending on what you're working on, you may not have the luxury of hand-loading, and maybe you want something that works cleanly as soon as you turn it on. Let's take a look at an alternative loading method that gets around some of these flaws at the cost of some added complexity. It's time to talk about load balancers. Load balancers are really the antithesis of manifolds, trading simplicity and ease of use for much more control over your outputs. While I would look upon you in both reverence and fear if you decided to make this your primary loading method, They do impart some benefits if you know where to make good use of them. In comparison with a manifold, where you have to wait for your machine's internal buffers to fill before your line will run at peak efficiency, a properly set up balancer will load all of your machines evenly right away. This is exceptionally helpful for those complex parts, which will otherwise take hours to load. Another place you can make use of balancers is at the loading area for freight stations. These can help stop your trains from becoming imbalanced, potentially leading to issues with overall throughput as some of your cars don't fully load. These benefits sound pretty good, right? Well, don't get too far ahead of yourselves. You still have to build the lizard doggone thing first. To that end, I'm going to show you how to put together a couple common load balancers. Starting off with a same-to-same balancer in the form of a 2-to-2, the goal is to ensure that both output belts flow at the same rate, regardless of whether the inputs are the same. To demonstrate this, I've taken some screws from the manifold section and intentionally unbalanced them. So I have an input belt of roughly 34 and another input belt of roughly 11. To achieve balance between these two belts, all we need is a set of splitters and a set of mergers. Running a belt from each splitter to the opposite merger will cause half of each belt to be merged onto the other, so that no matter the initial values, the outputs are always the same. You may want to use a similar setup to balance the inflow of two OR nodes that have different purities. Much more difficult, though, are conversion balancers, which take a number of inputs and convert them into a different number of evenly balanced outputs. This example converts those two belts from before into 5 evenly balanced outputs. The actual mechanics are a bit complex, but they are worth talking about, as they demonstrate a core concept used in many load balancers. So just bear with me. But first, let's get this place cleaned up a bit. Thanks, buddy. The two belts coming in consist of 50% of the overall input each. Those are then broken up with splitters to achieve 4 belts containing 25% of the initial input. Another layer of 4 splitters takes those 25% belts and splits them into 12 belts containing 8.33% of the initial input. This is where it begins to get a bit complicated. The two splits highlighted in red get remerged to the initial input, so that 8.33% can be balanced again. This happens over and over again as 1/6 of every input is sent back to the start. After every circulation, the amount of items moving through the remaining belts will increase, inching ever closer to their intended values. This is a common load balancer mechanic, and in this example allows us to effectively eliminate 2 of these splits, leaving us with a total of 10 belts, each containing 10% of the initial input. And all that's left to do is take those 10 belts and pair them off, so each output receives 20% of the initial input. You can do this next part in whatever configuration you want. I just happen to enjoy this one as it's mostly symmetrical, and most of the belts stay close to where they started. Alright, so those of you with a keen eye might have noticed it's a lot harder to set up a load balancer than it is to just run a manifold, and require you to know exactly what ratios you're balancing between before you even begin construction. Thankfully, there's a lot of documentation out there on common load balancer ratios, whether that be on the wiki or just scattered around the internet. An awesome community member who clearly knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, going by the name of NicoBuilds, recently did an awesome write-up over on Reddit on how to construct a load balancer for any complex ratio that you want. I feel I'd be doing a massive disservice to Nico if I attempted to understand and translate this to you all, so instead I'll just be linking that post as well as Nico's YouTube channel for you to go check out. Unfortunately, I don't have a good segue, so this is the part of the video where I talk to you about raw fish. Nope, wait, that's the wrong type of sushi. Any belt that moves more than one type of item is known as a sushi belt. In this example, these 6 assemblers are producing 3 different items and being fed by a single belt. Machine loading from a sushi belt is very similar to that of a normal manifold, but unlike a manifold, you can't just allow these items to make their own decisions and end up in the right place. So you need to provide them some guidance in the form of smart splitters. The configuration of the smart splitters is pretty straightforward. You have a single input and are able to specify what comes out of each of its 3 outputs. The first machine in this bank has its smart splitters configured like so, with concrete and steel pipes being allowed to move to the machine inputs and the side aligned with the rest of the throughput belt being set to overflow. This is what the config looks like. Every smart splitter in this line is configured exactly the same, with the only difference being which item is specified at each input. Just like a basic manifold, you can also merge the outputs of multiple machines running different recipes onto the same belt. This is a great way to condense how many belts you need when dealing with a lot of different, very low throughput items. And depending on how long you want to spend in prison for crimes against humanity, you can start to do fun stuff like use your sushi belts that have excess capacity to temporarily move items for you. I've done this with my middle two assemblers in this setup. They make reinforced iron plates which are only on the output belt for a short while before a smart splitter sends them back to the initial input belt so they can be loaded into the next set of machines for production of modular frames. They're also very space efficient when compared to alternative loading methods. Building that same setup with a dedicated belt for every item might look something like this, requiring you to run 8 total belts instead of just 2. Let's just go back to the way things were. That's much better. But just like every belting method, these have their downsides too. When setting up a sushi belt, you'll need an overflow solution. Most of the time this means setting up a sink at the end of your lines to move any overflow out of the way. Even if you exactly match your production numbers to your desired inputs, a single item received in the incorrect order will not be able to move anywhere and will cause a backup that stops your entire production line. The next thing to consider is that sushi belts are basically fancy manifolds, and so inherit a lot of those problems. For example, loading all of the inputs for an entire assembly line onto one belt will eat up your belt capacity very quickly. You can get around this by using your sushi belts selectively for only recipes that require smaller inputs, or by maxing out the tier of your throughput belt. There is another solution, but we'll get to that in a moment. If you decide to stick with a single belt, there's another issue you need to be aware of. Enough of a discrepancy in speed between your throughput belt and your feed belt can cause your machines to not feed like they should. Take these two assemblers making reinforced iron plates. Each machine only needs about 30 iron plates, but for the longest time they just wouldn't load. The higher tier throughput belt was speeding the items past before the lower tier feed belt could grab them.
Do you have any idea how fast I am?
If you find you're running into a similar issue, just give your feed belts a couple of extra tiers. You can also get around some of these issues by just mixing and matching the types of belts that you use to feed your machines. If you have a recipe that requires a lot of one item, like heavy modular frames being 80% screws, with the other inputs being mostly negligible, you can always run a sushi belt and then have a dedicated belt for your high throughput item. This is a great space-efficient compromise, as it can help your belt capacity go further without taking up as much space as running a dedicated belt for every item. Once you've used up all your inputs and the rest is just overflow, make sure it gets hooked up to a sink and your output ends up where it needs to be. Every belting method has its pros and cons, and whether they're a good fit for your factory really depends on your ability to put them in the right place. Hopefully you're now armed with some extra knowledge that will help you do just that. But if you'd like to take a closer look at any of the display setups in this building, you can grab the factory megaprint for free over on my Patreon. This is a place of learning that I wanted to keep accessible to as many pioneers as possible. Just come on over to the page and join as a free member. As an added bonus, it also makes 1.5 heavy modular frames per minute, or 3 per minute with slooping. And this is actually the main reason the video took so long to come out. Initially, I was going to show off all of these concepts with whatever I had lying around. Unfortunately, my brain would not let that be the end of it, and I thought it would be much cooler if it was also its own fully functioning factory. And so the FICSIT Learning Institute was feature creeped into existence. If you like what you see, and you want to help me bring to life even more of my unnecessarily complex ideas, the Patreon is also the best place to go to support the channel. Paid members get access to my megaprint library where I host the files for my other factories, some smaller cosmetic blueprints, and project updates before anyone else. Some truly awesome people who've already decided to support the channel are BJS, Sam G, Greg S, Hang, David G, Tom K, Keep to Yourself, Aurora, Cody G, Wigo, Tanner S, MacNell, Drew S, Andres T, Lex, TB2003, Grim Reaper 1982, Das Weißt du nicht, who I've probably mispronounced and I'm terribly sorry, but I tried, and Matt A. Extra special thanks to Gake62, who became my very first Mark II supporter, and Sebastian F, who's joined them. And an extra special thanks to my very first Mark III supporter, Jeffrey S. Everyone on this wall is an incredible boon to my content production, and I'm truly blessed to have all of you here. But no matter where you are on this wall, or if you're not on it at all, everyone here appears in my heart. Thanks for being here. And regardless of how you choose to spend the rest of your day, I hope it's an efficient one. And as always, I'm Jeezy, and I'll see you in the next one.